in all cases where Dr. Dourley has used Liber Novus, I'm just going to read it as the Red Book. Jung, The Nothing and the All by John Dourley. In the opening pages of the Red Book, Liber Novus, Jung identifies the severance of the spirit of this time from the spirit of the depths as the primary pathology of individual and culture in his milieu. He confesses that he himself had been its victim. I had become aware that I had lost my soul. He had objectified the soul in the name of psychology as science. He had removed her from the totality of human experience, reducing it to mind in interplay with the senses and to a sterile, scholarly approach to the depths of his own being. Such research made of him nothing less than a murderer of the soul. Later, in the Red Book, his portrait of the scholar of science is a depressing picture of a man imprisoned in his library within an isolated castle in the middle of a swamp. The hermit is nearly impervious both to the approach of Jung and to the presence of his own daughter in a nearby room. In Jung's imagination, the scholar's removal from his anima and from his soul becomes the same removal. There could hardly be a more forceful portrayal of living in an intellect quarantined from those vitalities accessed only in the flow of a deeper psychic and spiritual truth. The personal and social experience described here led to an ambivalent relation to science itself, expressed both in the Red Book and carried over into later works that have been published in the collected works. On the one hand, bowing to the scientism of his age, Jung would describe his work as scientific and so describe himself as a scientist. Yet in his Red Book, in dialogue with an imaginal Eastern giant seeking wisdom in the West, he indicts science with the crime of being a societal poison. It bears only a knowledge of outer things and knows little or nothing of the inner world of the enlivening divine. It has removed from its constituency the ability to believe, not in the sense of commitment to a formal creed or doctrine, but in the sense of an unmediated experience of the depths of reason itself. It is made up wholly of words and is a magic greatly injurious to its surroundings. This poison has paralyzed the enlightened who have drunk so deeply of it. In its self-imposed poverty, scientific research has lost the ability to deal with real life and has reduced the psyche to a mind estranged from the vigor and play of the full range of the total psyche. Nor was this critique softened in his later writings as the history of the factors contributing to such psychological impairment became clearer to him. He continued his critique of science as the dominant religion of his time, and so the new opium of the people. In particular, science was the preferred drug of the devotees of the goddess of reason and enlightenment rationalism, whose shallow clarity was so susceptible to archetypal possession and so to collective violence. Unremittingly harsh though this criticism remained, it must be made as clear as it possibly can that Jung was in no way opposed to science, the Enlightenment, or reason in themselves. What provoked his vitriol was the perverse reduction of human cognition and effect to science as the solely valid activity of consciousness. This real enemy is Blake's Eurism. The more recent history of the mind had produced a sovereignty of reason trending to science and technology, in the face of which the opposition of a largely fundamentalist and literal religion was all too easily and happily dismissed. The consequence was a society based upon a superficial, rational meaninglessness, a science reduced to impressive gadgetry, and a religion grounded in sacrosanct unintelligibility. The Red Book documents Jung's earliest diagnosis of the problem in anticipation of his later work. Fortunately, the soul Jung lost to a consciousness removed from it refused to yield to such illness. Effectively, the soul forced itself back upon Jung, and commerce with it became an incredible journey toward the unfathomable, which we call the divine. The depths insisted on their admission to consciousness, and though the cure they worked was never divested of suffering, the life they restored to Jung, as described in his Red Book, was to become the rudimentary structure and power of his later, more discursive writings. So much came to change. As the depths emerged, their sacred nature came with them. They could be prayed to. Pray to your depths. Awaken the dead. Jung came to see them revealed in the personal revelation of the dream, pointing to and enabling a far fuller life than could the dead system of his previous wholly intellectual psychology. He would contend that the heroic ego had to be dispensed with if the depths were to fully impact the conscious mind. He would insist only the recovery of the mind's living, giving connection with the depths of the psyche would create that more universal sympathy that could undermine the tragic, often lethal, animosities existing between nations and communities. Indeed, he came to realize that the hostilities of the First World War were externalizations of the psychic hostilities within his psyche, and the psyche of the masses caught up in the conflict. But perhaps the most important conclusion from these remarks remains Jung's frank confession at the opening and closing of his Red Book that its description of the recovery of his soul in such vivid, pre-rational imagery contained the primal stuff that he was to expound with more measured deliberation in his later so-called scientific work. This confession brings us to two major questions facing today's culture. 1. Is not the severance of the spirit of our time from the depths of collective and individual humanity not as prevalent in our time as in Jung's, and so is not his effort to bring about their integration as important now as it was when he wrote the Red Book? Would not this realization make the collected works a valued resource in theory and therapy, if humanity is to save itself from its own removal from the inner and only source that could unite its many conflicting archetypal expressions in diverse communities, bonded religiously and politically by the powers latent in those very depths? 2. Since Jung came to see, as his reflections in the Red Book continued, that the needed recovery of soul is a religious process, does the work not urge a new cultural religious perspective, one that may be in considerable tension with the major religious orthodoxies, a tension explaining their admiration of Jung's religious sensitivities and the refusal to accept the way he sees the religious impulse moving into a future beyond monotheistic claims in so many ways? The questions may coalesce in an examination of Jung's Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, 7 Sermons to the Dead, in the last section of the Red Book, Scrutinies. Here in the form of Gnostic myth, related elsewhere to the Gnostic teacher Basilides, is an effort to show how the spirit of the depths might come to pervade the spirit of the time with a societal and individual religiosity at once more internally profound and yet more externally encompassing than any cultural perspective then or now existent. Jung's thrust would be that the deeper into one's interiority one is led by the spirit of the depths, the more inclusive does one's embrace of the beyond become, since the within, the depth, is the living source of the totality of the beyond. And no less a figure than his anima insists, much against his preference, that he is indeed to be the bringer of a new religious perspective to his culture. The first of the series of sermons preached by Jung's spokesman, Philemon, to the disappointed dead returning without the enlightenment they expected from the other side, begins with what is, in effect, the corrosion of John's prologue. In the beginning is not the Word. Here, in the beginning, there is nothingness. The nothing would seem to precede the Word, and all mentation, beyond whose grasp it wholly lies. However, this nothingness is at the same time a fullness, a pleroma, and the source of both creation and consciousness. Here, Jung begins to play with a sophisticated metaphysical conception of participation. It is the essence or nature of the finite creature to live apart and distinct from the pleroma, and yet the creature and all that is participates or is part of the pleroma. Essentially removed from the eternal, the finite creature remains part of it, for the pleroma as the creature's source pervades the all. In this remark, Jung echoes the words of Marguerite Porete, a 14th century mystic, who insisted that unless she could attain the nothing, she could not be all. Indeed, Jung later all but quotes her literally when he refers to the sole validity of a contemporary spirituality as standing before the nothing out of which all may grow. At this point in the early unfolding of the myth, some allusion to the creature's return to the pleroma might be expected, but here it is not provided. On the contrary, the creature is by its nature driven to differentiate itself from the pleroma and, in so doing, to establish its individuality or singularity. At the time he wrote the Red Book, Jung considered the creature's return to the pleroma negatively, as a dissolution working to retreat from the ongoing creation of finite individuality, and so a betrayal of its essence. The mature Jung would reverse this position in his treatment of Eckhart, whose breakthrough into a dissolution in the Godhead was precisely what Jung here abhors. Jung, in the context of the Red Book, is primarily concerned with the procession of the creature from the pleroma and its ongoing finite development. To do this, he borrows a medieval phrase, principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, to describe the drive toward being an individual, moving progressively away from a regressive dissolution in the wealth of its source, the pleroma, to an ever deeper engagement in the demands of finite life and the making of the individual. Jung applies the same phrase to Jesus as representative of the divine life, latent in the unconscious and drawn into consciousness in the making of the divine human individual. In the 7 Sermons to the Dead, Jung is impressed by the opposites. Paradoxically, he describes them as not real in the pleroma, but as simply archetypal potential, yet very real in finite consciousness as an expression of the potential within the pleroma. Jung cautions about a one-sided identity with one of the opposites severed from the other. For instance, beauty must always entail the ugly. Psychic strategy demands an awareness of this situation, a knowing distance from psychic possession by any member of the opposites without inclusion of the other. In this early formulation, Jung refers to a rent in the pleroma and in finite consciousness, but refrains from emphasizing this note, which is so powerful in his late writings and especially in his answer to Job. Here he simply affirms that the eternal rent in the pleroma, which is the source of finite consciousness, seeks resolution of its split in the finite consciousness it births. The fissure is healed through the mutual redemption of the divine and human in conscious time, space, and history. In these early passages, the thought of Meister Eckhart is referenced, as it is a number of times throughout his works. Jung was later to write a piece on Eckhart, which is one of his finer contributions to the full integration of the religious and psychological meaning of religious experience and expression. In this work, and throughout much of his later writing, Jung's thought is at once theological, philosophical, and psychological, without being reducible to any one of these fragmentations of the mind when taken alone. Jung and Eckhart both appreciate the cyclical return of the mind to an identity with its origin, and the mind's resonance with such moments of identity in life subsequent to the experience. This union of epistemic, ontological, psychological, and theological truth illustrates the poverty of the contemporary scene, which is divested of a category as encompassing as is Jung's perspective in its resistance to all traditional disciplinary fragmentation into which his psychology might be forced and thus truncated. In short, in his early work, aspects of Jung's myth are already compatible with Eckhart, while some tension remains with the total Eckhart, more fully appropriated in later works. Eckhart discerned two dimensions in divinity, between which he drew a rather stringent difference. Eckhart's God was Trinitarian and imbued with so impassioned an inner life that it was called a bolitio, a boiling. In fact, so fervent was the inner boiling that it became an ebolitio, a boiling over. In the beginning, God boiled over, a Jungian wit might say. The primordial boiling over gave rise both to creation and to the fall. In creation, the existential ego realized it was removed from its source, and this removal became the motive for the drive to its recovery. The experience of a removal from a fontal origin of life as the basis of a drive to its ever fuller reappropriation is at least partially resonant with the suffering derived from Abraxas's reign as the ruler of the world of contradiction and the need to affirm one's unique self in its midst. In Jung's early myth, though profoundly paradoxical, the pleroma might well be understood as driven to express itself beyond itself in the life of each individual and creature, all of whom participate in it and its drive to individuation in the self-affirming creature. Thus, the seven sermons more than hint at a primordial plenitude driven to express itself beyond itself as the basis of each individual's drive and burden to realize a measure of divine completion in one's personal completion. This theme is at the core of Jung's answer to Job. Religiously and theologically, it brings up the serious question of the necessity driving the Creator to create and to seek its needful completion in the history of human consciousness. However, Eckhart also referred to a different dimension of God, namely Gottheit or Godhead. It is in the Godhead that the ego is led to a breakthrough, Durchbruch, and to an identity, a total fusion or absorption of the individual with the divine beyond distinction. The total return to this dimension of the divine lies behind Eckhart's twice-repeated prayer. I pray to God to rid me of God. I pray to God to rid me of God. This is a crucial point in Jung's later work on Eckhart. It would mean at a certain point of the psyche, every individual is vested with an ontological participation in the being of the divine, and that its attainment would mean unqualified identity with divinity, and Jung makes this explicit in his later essay on Eckhart. Quote, as a result of this retrograde process, the original state of identity with God is reestablished and a new potential is produced, unquote. In this line, Jung means psychic identity in a real and literal sense. In the 7 sermons, he is far less radical. Here, a moment of identity without difference is to be avoided as a form of regressive dissolution, destructive of one's progressive individuality and of that fullness of life that the pleroma demands of everyone. A later Jung could suggest that a moment of identity with the divine, or approximation thereof, is the ground of one's truest affirmation as an individual. As briefly noted, an added powerful and paradoxical player in the drive to individuality is Abraxas, variously described as the divinity beyond the opposites, and yet as their source and the ruler of their inevitability within this world. A condensation of Jung's attitude toward Abraxas can never be fully satisfactory. Basically, Jung would urge the individual to pursue one's most individual truth in the face of Abraxas and the suffering of the contradictions he imposes on every finite life. In the face of the inescapable conflicts, Abraxas lays on the individual a finitude one must bow to him, but never at the cost of abandoning one's deepest individual truth and the singularity of life it demands. Neither flight nor capitulation is acceptable. Jung suggests that the price Jesus paid in his oppositional subjugation to Abraxas demonstrates the latter's cruelty, and yet, in the end, Jesus has distilled the situation into the beauty of suffering. The Christian dead to whom these words are addressed rightly perceive that their perception of a wholly transcendent and self-sufficient divinity is being undermined and take great umbrage with such a view, even though they themselves and their age have outgrown such a divinity into a maturity that believes only what it can experience at a lesser level. Nonetheless, Philemon/Jung refuses to placate them with a simple replacement of what they have already outgrown. Rather, the preacher proclaims that God is not dead. He is as alive as ever, but his life is far different from the life of any God that Christians have understood. In effect, God is manifest in every creature. Jung, Philemon, is proposing a universal sacramentality in which every existent participates in the pleroma as its expression, and humanity can and should become aware of it. In later works, Jung will identify the opposites in the pleroma and in their expression moving to integration in human consciousness. But in this early work, he speaks less of the union of opposites and insists more on a simple awareness of their reality. In fact, he cautions against a too superficial, perhaps too rational, bringing together of Christ and Satan. Their more than intellectual truth is in a medium, a more than intellectual coming together. Later, Jung seems to have come to an incipient realization that the opposites not only have to be recognized and acknowledged, but that the deeper movement of the psyche is to bring them together. In his essay on the Trinity, he strongly suggests that the light and dark sons of the same Father, Christ and Satan, would move to an embrace or resolution in the psyche and so in history. Already in his Red Book, he is signaling that this unity is not a work of reason, but that of a mediator who unites opposites through a transrational process comparable to a new insight funded by the psyche like a new revelation. Again, a more thorough elaboration of Jung Philemon's reflection on the essence of humanity reveals it may not be as wholly entrapped in finitude as some formulations would insist. As noted, Jung is dealing with a dialectical conception of the essence of humanity as a participant in the pleroma and the pleroma in it. This side of his understanding of essence is a strong early evidence of Jung's essentialism and Platonic sensitivity. In the elaboration of the pleroma, there is a sense in which it does not exist, and yet it is also given the note of effectiveness. This means that archetypal potentiality drives towards its own realization. This is akin to what Jung was later to appreciate in the mystic Jacob Boehme, namely, the drive of God to find manifest expression and, through it, divine self-consciousness in creation and human consciousness. Every individual becomes an expression of the pleroma. Such expression is one's truest essence. The conclusion is that each human is potentially divine, and the process of maturation, individuation, is to move to the making of this potentiality real in the process of living life to its fullest. We will return to an elaboration of this conception in the 6th sermon, where it is related to a blue star, or light grounded in the pleroma, following and leading the individual through life's journey as gently but forcefully supporting that individual's deepest truth. It is not difficult to see in these themes a harbinger of Jung's later conception of the individual's primal form. During a late illness, his doctor appeared to Jung in his primal form as Basileus of Kos, an avatar of Kos, the temporal embodiment of the primal form which has existed from the beginning. As humanity's healing emissary, the doctor was to summon Jung back to Earth's demands. He was to die on the day Jung left his sickbed in a mysterious commerce between life recovered and life lost, one Jung never explained. But the imagery of the event is clearly of an energy like the eternal self as the underlying truth of the individual seeking its realization in time to be fully attained only in its eternal reality. Jung claims to have witnessed something like these events only once more. After her death, Jung's wife appeared to him in her primal or objective truth beyond emotion and projection, dressed as in a portrait that took Jung back through the particular moments of their life together, to the deepest meaning running through it all. Her whole life had been guided to her deeper truth, and now she stood in its eternal realization as fully her own. To illustrate the many sides of life in the world beyond, Jung would later note that on one occasion he woke to the realization that he had spent a day with his wife after her death, and that she had continued in death to work on her Grail project, as if still to complete herself. It would appear that the attainment of the primal form and some kind of continued development are not incompatible, in the world from which the dead in the Red Book return. From this perspective of life's meaning as self-affirmation, the figure of Christ can be seen as the proto-individual because he represents for Jung the man who lived out his individual truth even to the cruel death imposed by Abraxas. In his later work, Jung describes Jesus as a principium individuationis. In the earlier Red Book, Jung postulates, "We could not bear Christ as he is unbearable, but we should be Christs. To be a Christ, as distinct from being a Christian, means that the individual realizes that he or she must imitate or emulate no one. Christ lived out his life wholly faithful to his essential truth." Jung confesses that he himself had been a Christian, but not a Christ. Imitators of Christ are thus indicted. They have imitated it, the life of Christ, but they have not lived their own lives as you have lived yours. Everyone would have to take their own life into their own hands, faithful to their own essence and their own love. Here the premonition of the self becomes the individual's essence and the basis of true love. The image of a life lived beyond emulation or imitation, out of the depths of one's continuity with the pleroma, is indeed enticing. It draws attention to several attributes of the Christ figure not prominent in more traditional depictions. It gives a priority to an inner relationship as the experiential substance not only of Christianity, but of all religions. The point reappears later in Jung's insistence that the initial approach of the divine to the human is always from within. It also strongly suggests that reliance on the interior life beyond imitation or emulation carries with it a greater sympathetic or compassionate embrace of all that lies beyond such profound interiority. The journey inward is always the journey outward. In reflecting on the relation of religion to the psychic laws that control historical development, Jung will assert that Christianity's initial one-sidedness would eventually demand its own transcendence. The unqualified goodness of Christ split the figure from its own opposite, Satan, who became the dark brother of Christ. In his work after the Red Book, Jung refers to the split as the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of spirit, not through the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with psychological law. This side of Jungian psychology points to the presence of an operating philosophy of history in which the archetypal basis of consciousness seeks its full realization in historical consciousness with a truly Hegelian necessity. From this passage, Jung goes on to locate the inevitable reversal of Christian one-sidedness in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. In the Red Book's description of the figure of Christ as living wholly out of his individualizing interiority to the point of death, Jung is anticipating a later foundational theme that divinity must express its totality beyond itself to be fully itself. This conviction would move Jung from a Trinitarian to a Quaternitarian paradigm in terms of much more inclusive sense of the sacred in the spirit of the quaternity than the Christian spirit can proffer. Such a spirit would unite in its life the divine realities of Christ and Satan, male and female, spirit and matter. Currently, the self would endorse this consciousness as an expression of so much more than the simple union of Father and Son in a relatively pallid Christian spirit. In this area alone, the contention that Jung was the bearer of a new religion is well-founded, as is his claim in his dialogue with Father Victor White, O.P., that he was a modern Joachim de Fiore. Joachim, the late 12th and early 13th century monk, saw the imminent advent of a new religious spirit that, in fact, did blossom in the mendicant orders and scholasticism of the mid-13th century. His broadening of the sense of the sacred would also be operative in Jung's sustained interest in Mercurius as an older brother of Christ, living out rudimentary elements of a humanity hardly appreciated by traditional views. When Jung endorses Mercurius as capax utrius, capable of both, he points to a figure whose spiritual life is integrated with his animal life to a degree beyond the Christian pale. And yet it is crucial to recognize that Jung's insistence on the drive of the pleroma to find its expression in the individual creature as the meaning of creation itself speaks of an ideal individual free of all forms of individualism. The individual the source seeks is one whose individuality is the very basis of a relation to the totality. Jung was later to make this point explicit in the psychology of the unus mundus, the one world. In the footsteps of Gerhard Dorn, he describes a process beginning in an asceticism so rigorous it is well depicted as death, moving to a sense of resurrection in a celum, heaven, of the glorified body. The development culminates in the experience of the individual's continuity with the totality through the eternal ground of all empirical being as the ground of one's personal being. The psychology of the unus mundus, thus described, would involve the integration of the many complexes within the individual coupled with the individual's empathetic relation to the totality, since individual and totality share the same ground. In the Red Book, this psychology is latent in the participation of the individual in the pleroma as the underlying and generative power in each creature. Such universal compassion and full participation in the ground, Jung confesses, can only be approximated in the finite psyche. However limited it may be, the drive to such depth and extension cannot be evaded. As noted previously in the earlier pages of the Red Book, Jung describes the essence of the individual as largely confined by the finite and driven to affirm its individuality in that context. But in the seventh Sermon to the Dead, he seems to greatly extend this notion to the essence of humanity in imagery that foreshadows the reality of the self. Here he speaks of a turn inward to the realm of a blue star. Quote, "This is the one God of this one man. This is his world, his pleroma, his divinity." Unquote. The star can be the object of prayer. Its blue light guides the individual through life and toward an individuality that the star itself crowns. It is the individual's stellar nature and truest and innermost self that simply and singly is. Accessing the star involves a cunning attitude toward Abraxas as ruler of the world. He can neither be fled nor embraced, but neither can one capitulate to him and still remain under the influence of the blue star. Rather, suffering Abraxas is the key to living the spiritual and moral life toward the blue star, and in a sense becoming Abraxas oneself in the ensuing freedom gained. The servant of the blue star is the mediator, an individual who suffers the opposites in what could well be called the redemption of God, appreciated by God and humanity as completing the divine effort in creation. In this context, Mediator means one in whom the opposites come together in an authentic integration of a total divinity with a total humanity. But if individuation is to be equated with divinization, actualized in the individual living toward the truth of the blue star, what would be the social and political consequences for a society composed of such individuals? Would there not be a constant threat to the social order by those not so much led but possessed by their star in conflict with the presiding culture? In the Red Book, Jung shows that he is at least aware of the problem and deals with it again in his later works. In the fifth sermon, Philemon pits community against singleness. Put simply, singleness is opposed to community. As he amplifies this opposition, Philemon contends community is necessary as a kind of collective defense against the overwhelming importunities of the gods and demons, i.e., archetypal compulsions on the membership. The thrust would seem to be that community protects those in it from the invasion of powers that would take over individuals whose inflated singleness could threaten society itself. Here he sees the need for community as imposed on humanity by the divine as protection against gods and demons. But he notes briefly as well that when community does more than this, more is bad. The danger is that community always demands submission to others, and so is in permanent tension with the drive to singularity, which he so highly respects. In singleness, one places oneself above others in the avoidance of slavery, and so in the Septem Sermones, and also in his wider work, the tension between community and individual remain identified, but they are hardly resolved, if ever they can be. At this early stage, restraint in submission to the slavery of community remains in tension with self-affirmation as a divine demand. While still sensitive to the tension between communal submission and singleness depicted in the Red Book, a later Jung would seem to give a certain priority to singleness. Indeed, he could be read to place it in almost moral categories based on fidelity to the self in every circumstance, individual and collective. In later discussions of the issue, Jung had become fully familiar with the reality of social archetypal possession. Such politico-social delusional systems could lead vast populations into widespread neuroses and forms of societal lunacy, which Jung saw in his contemporary world, and which only a mystical fool could anticipate in their advent. In fact, any form of ism, religious or political, had the archetypal power to bond its membership in paroxysms of collective unconsciousness. It would appear that the role of community in protecting its members from divine possession far too often could force them into it. The conflict between community and individual that Jung saw in his society at the time he wrote the Red Book is certainly occurring in ours. The far right returns with a sense of absolute authority that can move to violence. Such despotism, coupled with the nationalism and populism, also embodies a problematic attitude toward human rights. It is particularly insidious in its rejection of an underlying human commonality as the ground for the rejection of exceptionalism and supremacy in any significant realm of the human spirit. What does Jung propose in the name of the hopefully offsetting singleness he describes in the Red Book? His response is noble, yet one must also wonder if, like all that is noble, it is not also fragile. In the face of the mass movements of community over the singular individual, he writes, quote, "Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself," unquote. The individual organization here applauded is obviously the effect of the self coming to greater prominence in the individual psyche. But can such exceptional drama occur in the face of a population possessed? How many were as well organized as the Gestapo in the Nazi period? How many victims of any Holocaust anywhere were as well organized as the perpetrators? And yet, on sustained reflection, what other resources are available than the power of inner resistance, at least informing and humanizing the activist zeal? Activism in the hope of change is itself often archetypally possessed. For instance, in some of its greatest stories, as in Marxism, fascism, communism, and the strange marriage of democracy with unrestrained capitalism, activism has become the oppressor it hoped to overthrow. The Red Book has been described as bringing in a new religiosity, or at least as an effort to grasp the religious future development of the West. Perhaps this is nowhere more evident than in the social-political field. In continuity with the above passage on the need for the individual to be as well organized as the masses, Jung writes, quote, "The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this he needs the evidence of inner, transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass," unquote. What does being anchored in God really mean? In the Red Book, it meant being led by the blue star. In the context of the later citation, it means a consciousness impregnated by the self. Much is at stake in this seemingly arcane issue, possibly the survival of humanity itself. Should consciousness fail to anchor itself in God, the late Jung warns that humanity is threatened with universal genocide if we cannot work out the way of salvation by a symbolic death. In context, Jung means the death of the currently presiding symbol, in his day the imagination of the monomind, whether religious and or secular, and the birth of a symbol more capable of sustaining the full range of the human spirit and its ground. But what would this look like in practice? The meaning of dreams could be again taken seriously as the revelation of a greatly extended inner world, and so induce compassion for all that exists in the outer world. Opposites both within and without could be seen as valid, each with a legitimate seat in a much wider conscious assembly. The power of the archetypal could be recognized, and in its recognition be divested of its current power to convene communities of hatred in deeply rooted conflict. The social reformer would become keenly aware of the atrocities that attend the rebirth of a god and be chastened in one's zeal. With his fear of genocide, Jung was sensitive to the dark side, but could pen words of hope in the face of ideological, archetypal conflicts of his day. The afternoon of humanity in a distant future may yet evolve a different ideal. In time, even conquest will cease to be a dream. Here, Jung acknowledges that conquest rests on the conflict of psychic opposites, and he seeks its abolition in their mutual defeat or embrace beyond their antipathy. In his later works, Jung went on to paint the basic drive of the psyche toward the resolution of inner conflict, as the only real basis for the resolution of the conflicts that destroy bodily lives on external battlefields. In the spirit of our time, which is also severed from the spirit of the depths, ideological conflict drives toward fragmentation among individuals infected with an unrelated individualism and among political and national communities affirming their own limited reality as the best and only one. The afternoon of a conquest-free humanity does indeed seem distant, yet running through Jung's psychology, which is rooted in his own kind of ontology and its keen philosophy of history, there lives a hope against which no darkness would prevail. It shines through in so surprising a place as his understanding of an evolving religious sentiment growing in our midst, namely, that to be human is to be divine, and to be moved toward divinity by divinity itself. For Jung, such insight began in the Red Book when he realized that those who lived life to the fullest at the insistence of God were to become their own gods. If the split between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths remains the major challenge of our epoch, what consciousness would its healing bring to our day? Such consciousness would be religious in that it would be aware of the depths of the human spirit and soul and the numinous power that dwells in the creative commonality that belongs to all and authors all religions. But such consciousness could not be reduced to religion as understood within traditional institutions and those taking shape beyond them. Such consciousness would be theological. It would be aware that the referent of religious revelation, dogmatic affirmation, and moral ritual enactment is the power of the unconscious expressed in them, but such consciousness could not be reduced to theology, which, in the end, must hail the variant as the totality. Such consciousness would be a metaphysics made up of an ontology, epistemology, and philosophy of history. It would be aware that what is an inner archetypal power creating the experience of an ultimate power is destined to be exhaustively born in human history. But such consciousness could not be reduced to metaphysics and its continued and current fear of the deeply subjective. Such consciousness would be scientific, but it would be a science informed by a legitimate subjectivity, aware of a deeper dimension of human cognition than science, rightfully true to itself, can accommodate. Again, such consciousness could not be reduced to science as usually understood. Indeed, such consciousness would also be related to medicine, psychiatry, physics, comparable mythology, anthropology, and more. It would be like the medieval reductio, an affirmation that all disciplines lead back to the divine when their depths are plumbed. But such consciousness could not be reduced to any discipline or to a forced and artificial union of all of them. In healing the crevice between mind and soul, Jung is reaching for a new form of consciousness, one that would release the full powers of the soul into a consciousness hopefully inclusive of all the fragmented domains of mind, now caught in disciplinary distinctions and imprisoned in discrete departments in the halls of knowledge of our time. It would be a consciousness born out of the original experience, which alone is convincing. Jung is citing the Buddha here and offers some sense of what the new consciousness would entail. But because it would be so rich and new, it is difficult to lay it out in point-by-point form. Jung recognized the difficulty in doing so when, in relation to the new sense of interiority now demanded in the recovery of the soul, he wrote, quote, That is why nobody knows what ways of approach are open to man, what inner experiences he could still pass through, and what psychic facts underlie the religious myth, unquote. Whatever facts may underlie the new myth, they would coalesce around Jung's most encompassing description of it. Quote, "It was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. This realization is a millennial process. Millennial it may well be, but the realization that to be human is to be latently divine on the way to one's unique truth began for Jung as early as the pages of the Red Book." I'm still reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, and this is the about the contributors, and this is a description of John Dourley. John Dourley, PhD, is a graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich, 1980, Fordham University, New York City, 1971, St. Michael's College, Toronto, 1966, St. Paul University, Ottawa, 1964, and St. Patrick's College, Ottawa University, 1957. He taught in the Religion Department of Carleton University, Ottawa, at St. Patrick's College, 1970 to 79, and in the Parent Department at Carleton until 2001. He is currently Professor Emeritus. He has written extensively on Jung and religion and has 3 books with Routledge since 2008. Paul Tillich, Carl Jung and the Recovery of Religion, 2008. On Behalf of the Mystical Fool, Jung on the Religious Situation, 2009. And Jung and His Mystics, In the End, It All Comes to Nothing, 2014. He is a training and supervising analyst at the Ontario Association of Jungian Analysts, Toronto, and a member of AGAP, Zurich. He is a Catholic priest and member of the religious order, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. There will be outtakes and other flubs because this is a very difficult essay. And by that I mean it's a very difficult essay to read. And the refusal to accept the way he sees the religious impulse moving into a future beyond monotheistic claims. Long sentences. The more inclusive does one's embrace to the beyond becomes... Still not reading it with the right emphasis. I'm sorry about that. Let's see. I say again, in the beginning is not the word. I'll just mention here as a footnote that the article about Meister Eckhart that was mentioned in this paragraph is found in volume 6 of the collected works, paragraphs 406 to 433. In the beginning, God boiled over, a Jungian wit might say. It is into the Godhead that the ego is led to a breakthrough, Durchbruch. Okay, my German pronunciation is terrible, so in her, after her death, Jung's wife appeared to her, just as in a portrait that took Jung back through the particular moments of their life together to the deepest meaning running through it all. Her whole life had been guided to her deeper truth, and now she stood in its Yep, this is pretty heavy stuff. You're going to really understand how heavy when I tell you who John Dourley is. Just wait. In reflecting on the relation of religion to the psychic laws that control historical development, Jung will assert that Christianity's initial one-sidedness would eventually demand its own transcendence. The unqualified goodness of Christ split the figure from its own opposite, Satan, who became the dark brother of Christ. In his work after the Red Book, Jung refers to the split as the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of spirit, not through the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with psychological law. This side of Jungian psychology points to the presence of an operating philosophy of history in which the archetypal basis of consciousness seeks its full realization in historical consciousness with a truly Hegelian necessity. From this passage, Jung goes on to locate the inevitable reversal of Christian one-sidedness in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. The thrust would seem to be that community protects those in it from the invasion of powers that would take over individuals whose inflated singleness could threaten society itself. Here he sees the need for community as imposed on humanity by the divine as protection against gods and demons. But he notes briefly as well that when community does more than this, more is bad. The danger is that community always demands submission to others, and so is in permanent tension with the drive to singularity. The tension between community and individual remain identified, but they are hardly resolved, if ever they can be. In fact, any form of ism, religious or political, had the archetypal power to bond its membership in paroxysms of collective unconscious. It was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. This realization is a millennial process. Millennial it may well be, but the realization that to be human is to be latently divine on the way to one's unique truth began for Jung as early as the pages. He is a Catholic priest.